I stood on my ridge at dawn, watching 30 industrial pumps roar to life across my pastures. The sound was deafening, beautiful. Below me, the HOA's pristine resort lake began to drop, inch by inch, foot by foot. The crystal-clear water that had made their luxury homes worth millions was disappearing before my eyes. Dead fish floated to the surface as the lake bed emerged, thick with green algae and decades of accumulated mud. The stench was overwhelming. My phone buzzed with angry calls from Corinne Whitmore, the HOA president who had destroyed my family's century-old barn just 3 weeks earlier. She was screaming about property values and legal action. I let it go to voicemail. You see, what Corinne and her wealthy neighbors never understood was simple. My great-grandfather had built this ranch in 1924. My natural spring fed their precious lake, and I had just turned off the tap. That was the day I learned that revenge is a dish, best served with proper water rights documentation. Every morning for the past 15 years, I woke up to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the gentle bubbling of the natural spring that had sustained my family for 3 generations. My name is Jake Morrison, and I am the third-generation owner of the Double M Ranch, 40 acres of pristine Texas hill country that my great-grandfather homesteaded in 1924. The morning routine never changed. Coffee first, black and strong. Then out to the barn to check on the cattle and feed the horses. The barn was magnificent. Built from native limestone and cedar, it housed my grandfather's vintage John Deere tractor, hand-forged farming tools that dated back to the 1940s, and countless family heirlooms that told the story of hard work and honest living. My property sat like an island of agricultural peace in the middle of what had become Willowbrook Estates, a luxury housing development that had grown up around me over the past decade. Where once there had been open rangeland and scattered family farms, now there were manicured lawns, swimming pools, and houses that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. The spring that bubbled up from the limestone aquifer was the heart of everything. Crystal clear water that had never run dry, even during the worst droughts. It fed my cattle, watered my pastures, and flowed down through a series of natural pools before emptying into Willowbrook Lake, the centerpiece of the HOA's resort-style amenities. I never had a problem with my neighbors, at least not at first. We coexisted peacefully. They lived their lives behind their iron gates and manicured hedges, and I lived mine among the cattle and wide-open spaces. My daily routine was simple and satisfying. Check the fences, rotate the cattle between pastures, maintain the equipment, and preserve the land that had been passed down through my family. The problem started small. Occasional complaints about the smell of cattle manure, questions about whether my property was properly zoned for agricultural use, comments from passing joggers about how my rustic buildings did not match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. I brushed them off. After all, I had been here first. My family had been working this land for nearly a century. But the complaints grew more frequent and more specific. The morning I found the first official HOA violation notice tucked into my mailbox, I knew something had changed. The letter was printed on expensive letterhead with the Willowbrook Estates logo at the top. It was addressed to me personally and signed by someone named Corinne Whitmore, HOA president. The violation was for failure to maintain exterior paint standards on agricultural structures. They wanted me to paint my barn, the same barn that had weathered 100 years of Texas storms and still stood solid as the day my great-grandfather built it. The same barn that had housed 4 generations of farming equipment and family memories. I read the letter 3 times, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern ridge, casting long shadows across my pastures. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday, and the day before, and every day for the past 15 years. But something fundamental had shifted. I folded the letter carefully and walked back toward the house. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the south pasture, and the spring was singing its eternal song. But for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger on my own land. The violation notices arrived like clockwork. Every week, another complaint, another demand, another threat to the way of life my family had built over 3 generations. First, it was the barn paint. Then it was the unsightly farming equipment that was supposedly visible from the road. Next came complaints about cattle odors, property line disputes, and allegations that my ranch was operating outside of proper zoning regulations. Each letter came with deadlines, fine schedules, and increasingly aggressive language about community standards and property values. After the fifth violation notice, I decided to attend an HOA meeting. I had never been to one before. I had never needed to. The meeting was held in the community center, a sprawling building with marble floors and crystal chandeliers that looked more like a luxury hotel than a neighborhood meeting space. When I walked in wearing my work clothes and boots, the conversation stopped. 25 perfectly dressed residents turned to stare at me like I had just walked into the wrong party. The hostility was immediate and palpable. "You must be Jake Morrison," said a woman in a white blazer who approached me with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "I am Karen Whitmore, HOA president. We have been hopping to meet you." Karen was exactly what I had expected. Perfectly manicured blonde hair, expensive jewelry, and a BMW key fob that she twisted between her fingers like a nervous habit. She spoke in the kind of condescending tone that people use when they think they are talking to someone beneath their social station. "We have some concerns about your property," she continued. "I am sure you understand that we all have a responsibility to maintain the community standards that protect everyone's property values." I listened as she outlined their complaints. The barn was an eyesore. The cattle were a nuisance. The farming equipment was inappropriate for a residential area. My property was dragging down the value of the entire neighborhood. "Have you considered selling?" asked a man in a golf shirt who introduced himself as the HOA treasurer. "There are developers who would pay very well for your acreage. You could retire comfortably." That was when I realized this was not about paint or property standards. This was about money. They wanted my land. I pulled out a manila folder that contained the original deed to my property, agricultural exemption certificates, and a survey map that showed my family had owned this land since 1924. I spread the documents on the conference table and watched their faces change. "Gentlemen and ladies," I said calmly, "my family has been farming this land for nearly a century. We predate your development by 50 years. We are legally protected under agricultural exemption laws, and we have water rights that date back to the original homestead patent." The room fell silent. Karen's smile disappeared entirely. "Nevertheless," she said, "we expect you to be a good neighbor and comply with reasonable requests for community improvement." The meeting ended with thinly veiled threats and promises of further action if I did not cooperate. I drove home that night knowing I was in for a fight. The harassment began immediately. Anonymous complaints to the EPA about agricultural runoff. Surprise inspections from animal control officers who had received tips about neglected livestock. Calls to the county health department about septic system violations. Every complaint was investigated and dismissed, but the process was exhausting and expensive. I hired an attorney who specialized in agricultural law. He warned me that the HOA had deep pockets and political connections. They could make my life miserable with legal fees and bureaucratic harassment, even if they could not force me to sell. They are trying to bleed you dry, he told me. The question is whether you have the resources to fight back. That was when I began to research Corinne Whitmore and the Willowbrook Estates development. What I found made my blood boil. The HOA was not just harassing me for property values. They had a master plan. Buried in county planning documents, I discovered the proposed Phase 3 expansion of Willowbrook Estates. The plan included a golf course, expanded lake facilities, and a luxury resort hotel. The proposed development required access to additional water rights and would be built on property that was currently zoned for agriculture. My property, my spring, my family's legacy. They were not trying to make me a better neighbor. They were trying to drive me out so they could steal my land and my water. The legal assault began in earnest after that first HOA meeting. My attorney, Sam Rodriguez, had warned me it would get ugly, but I was not prepared for the systematic campaign of harassment that followed. First came the lawsuits, frivolous complaints filed in rapid succession, noise ordinance violations for the sound of cattle, environmental impact claims about agricultural runoff, property line disputes that challenged boundaries that had been established and recorded for decades. Each lawsuit required a response, a legal filing, and attorney fees that quickly mounted into the thousands. Corinne Whitmore was relentless. She filed complaints with every government agency she could think of. The State Environmental Agency investigated claims of groundwater contamination. The county zoning board received formal challenges to my agricultural exemption status. The fire marshal was called to inspect my barn for safety violations. Every complaint was baseless. Every investigation concluded that my ranch was operating within all legal requirements, but the process was designed to exhaust my resources and my patience. I was spending more time in courtrooms and government offices than I was spending on my own land. The dirty tricks started small but escalated quickly. I would return from town to find my gates left open and cattle wandering loose on the county road. Farm equipment that had been working perfectly would mysteriously break down overnight. Fence lines were cut, water troughs were damaged, and expensive irrigation equipment was vandalized. I installed security cameras, but the harassment became more sophisticated. Corinne had been spreading rumors about me to local businesses. My feed supplier started requiring cash payments in advance. The veterinarian who had been treating my cattle for 10 years suddenly became too busy to return my calls. The local mechanic who had maintained my equipment began refusing to service my tractors. I was being systematically isolated from the community I had been part of my entire life. The breakthrough came when I received an anonymous package in my mailbox. Inside was a stack of photocopied documents that appeared to be internal HOA communications. Someone on the inside was trying to help me. The documents revealed the full scope of Corinne's plan. The HOA had been working with a development company owned by her husband's construction business. They had already secured preliminary approval for the Phase 3 expansion, contingent on acquiring additional water rights and the property where my ranch currently stood. The most damaging document was a memo from Corinne to the HOA board outlining their strategy. "Morrison is stubborn but not wealthy," she had written. "Sustained legal pressure and community isolation should force a sale within 12 months. The water rights alone are worth more than the asking price." They had been planning this for years. Every violation notice, Every complaint, every legal challenge was part of a calculated campaign to drive me off my land so they could seize my water rights and expand their luxury development. I took the documents to Sam Rodriguez, who immediately filed them with the court as evidence of harassment and conspiracy. But he warned me that proving conspiracy would be difficult and expensive. They are being very careful to stay within the law, he told me. What they are doing is unethical and predatory, but it is not necessarily illegal. Your best defense is to make sure you never give them a legitimate reason to take action against you. The mediation sessions were a joke. Karen and her lawyers would arrive with insulting buyout offers and thinly veiled threats about eminent domain proceedings. They offered me a fraction of what my land was worth and demanded that I sign away my water rights as part of the deal. "You are going to lose this fight," Karen told me during one particularly heated mediation session. "We have resources you cannot match. We have political connections you do not have. You can sell now and walk away with something, or you can fight us and lose everything." I looked across the conference table at her perfectly manicured face and her smug expression. She was right about one thing. I could not match their resources in a traditional legal fight. I could not afford years of litigation and appeals. I could not survive the systematic harassment and isolation. But I had something they did not understand. I had intimate knowledge of my land, my water, and the natural systems that sustained everything they had built. I was beginning to formulate a plan that would not require lawyers or courtrooms. I was going to fight back on my own terms. I knew something was wrong the moment I turned onto my property. The silence was unnatural. No cattle lowing, no birds singing. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. I had been away for a long weekend, visiting my sister in Houston and trying to clear my head after months of legal battles. What I found when I crested the hill toward my barn will haunt me for the rest of my life. There was nothing left, just a pile of splintered wood, twisted metal, and limestone blocks that had once been my family's century-old barn. The destruction was complete and devastating. Generations of farming equipment, family heirlooms, and irreplaceable memories had been reduced to rubble. I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at the devastation. My grandfather's 1952 John Deere tractor, the one he had taught me to drive when I was 8 years old, was buried somewhere in that pile of debris. The hand-forged tools that had built this ranch were gone. Photographs of my great-grandfather breaking his first horses. My grandmother's preserving jars that she had used to feed the family through the Depression. All of it was gone. I walked through the wreckage in a daze. Pieces of my family's history were scattered across the pasture like shrapnel from an explosion. I found a twisted piece of metal that had once been part of my grandfather's plow. A broken picture frame that had held a photograph of my great-grandfather standing in front of the barn on the day he finished building it. The official notice was tucked under a rock near what had been the barn door. Emergency demolition order. Signed by the county building inspector. Structural engineering report claiming the barn was unsafe and presented an imminent danger to public safety. I read the documents 3 times before the full scope of what had happened became clear. While I was away, the HOA had obtained an emergency court order claiming my barn was a public hazard. They had hired a demolition crew to tear it down immediately to protect the community from potential collapse. The demolition crew was owned by Whitmore Construction, Karen's husband's company. I called Sam Rodriguez from the ruins of my barn. He was furious but not surprised. "They waited until you were out of town," he said. "This was planned. They had the demolition crew standing by, waiting for their opportunity." I drove straight to Karen's house. She lived in a gated mansion at the top of the hill overlooking the lake. The house was worth more than my entire ranch, with manicured gardens, a circular driveway, and a three-car garage that housed her white BMW, her husband's Mercedes, and a boat that probably cost more than most people's homes. I rang the doorbell and waited. When Corinne opened the door, she was wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of wine. She looked at me with the same condescending smile I had seen at every HOA meeting. "Jake," she said, "I heard about your barn, such a shame. But honestly, it was a safety hazard. We were protecting the community." "You destroyed my family's history," I said. "A century of memories, irreplaceable heirlooms." "Oh, please," she said with a dismissive wave. "It was just an old building. You can build a new one, a better one that actually fits with the neighborhood aesthetic." "That barn was built by my great-grandfather's hands," I said. "It survived the Dust Bowl, the Depression, 2 world wars, and 100 years of Texas storms. It was not going anywhere." Corinne's expression hardened. "Look, Jake, I tried to be reasonable with you. I offered you a fair price for your property. You could have walked away with enough money to buy a nice ranch somewhere else, but you chose to be stubborn." "This is not about money," I said. "This is about my family's legacy." "Your family's legacy is holding back progress," she said. "This community is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Your little ranch is an eyesore that drags down property values for everyone. Sometimes progress requires sacrifice." I stood there on her doorstep, looking at her perfectly made-up face and her expensive silk robe, and I realized something important. This woman had no concept of what she had just destroyed. To her, my barn was just an obstacle to profit. My family's history was just an inconvenience to be demolished and discarded. The police report I filed went nowhere. The demolition had been conducted under proper permits with appropriate legal authority. The building inspector who had signed the emergency order was a golf buddy of Corinne's husband. The county judge who had approved the demolition was running for re-election with financial backing from the Willowbrook Estates Development Fund. That night, I walked down to my spring for the first time since returning home. The water bubbled up from the limestone aquifer just as it had for thousands of years, crystal clear and cold, flowing down through the natural pools toward the lake where Corinne and her wealthy neighbors enjoyed their morning swims and evening boat rides. I stood there in the darkness, listening to the water and thinking about my great-grandfather. He had chosen this spot for the ranch because of the spring. He had built everything around this natural source of life. The barn, the house, the fences, the pastures. Everything was positioned to work with the water, not against it. That was when I had the idea that would change everything. Corinne had destroyed my barn, but she had made one critical mistake. She had forgotten that the water that filled their precious lake came from my spring. She had forgotten that my family's water rights predated their development by 50 years. She had forgotten that I controlled the source. The next morning, I began the most important research project of my life. I spent hours at the county courthouse, the State Water Commission, and the University Agricultural Extension Office. I needed to understand exactly what I could and could not do with my water rights. What I discovered was better than I had dared to hope. My great-grandfather's original homestead patent included senior water rights to the spring and all water originating on my property. Those rights had been continuously maintained and updated through 3 generations of my family. Under Texas water law, I had the absolute right to capture, use, and dispose of any water that originated on my land. The HOA's lake was entirely dependent on my spring. Without the constant flow of fresh water from my property, the lake would become a stagnant pond within weeks. The expensive lakefront homes, the resort amenities, the property values that Karen was so obsessed with protecting, all of it depended on water that I legally controlled. I contacted a water engineering consultant named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who specialized in agricultural irrigation systems. I told her I was planning to upgrade my ranch irrigation to support expanded cattle operations. She came out to survey my property and was impressed by the volume and quality of water produced by my spring. "You have an exceptional water source," she told me. "With proper pumping and distribution, you could irrigate several hundred acres. The flow rate is remarkable." Dr. Mitchell designed a comprehensive irrigation system that would capture and redirect the spring water to maximize pasture productivity. The system required 30 industrial-grade pumps, miles of underground pipe, and a network of distribution points that would ensure every acre of my ranch received optimal water coverage. "This will transform your ranch," she said as she showed me the engineering drawings. "You will be able to support twice as many cattle and dramatically improve your grass production." I ordered the equipment through multiple suppliers to avoid attracting attention. 30 Grundfos industrial pumps rated at 500 gallons per minute each, PVC pipe in various diameters, electrical controls and monitoring systems, flow meters and pressure regulators. Everything I needed to build the most sophisticated irrigation system in the county. The installation took 3 weeks. I worked mostly at night when the HOA residents were asleep and the county road was empty. The pump stations were disguised as routine ranch infrastructure, irrigation improvements that any serious cattle operation might install. The network was complex but elegant. The main pumps were positioned at the spring source, where they could capture the water as it emerged from the aquifer. Secondary pumps were distributed throughout the ranch, creating a redundant system that could operate independently or in coordination depending on water demand. The control system was the key to everything. I could operate the pumps individually or collectively, adjusting flow rates and distribution patterns to optimize irrigation efficiency. More importantly, I could redirect the entire spring output away from its natural course toward the lake and onto my pastures. I tested the system gradually, running different combinations of pumps for short periods to ensure everything worked properly. The results were dramatic. Areas of my ranch that had been dry and marginal became lush green pastures within days. My cattle were healthier and more productive than they had ever been. The lake level dropped slightly during my testing, but not enough to attract attention. The HOA residents probably assumed it was normal seasonal variation or increased evaporation due to the hot summer weather. I monitored their community forums and social media groups to gauge their awareness of any changes. There were occasional comments about the lake, seeming a bit lower than usual, but nothing that suggested they understood what was happening. The timing had to be perfect. I had learned that the annual Willowbrook Estates Summer Festival was scheduled for the last weekend in July. 500 guests were expected for 3 days of lakeside activities, including swimming, boating, fishing, and outdoor dining. The event was the social highlight of the year for the HOA and a major marketing opportunity for the development company. Property tours were scheduled for potential buyers. The local media had been invited to cover the festival. County commissioners and state legislators were expected to attend. This was Karen's chance to showcase the lifestyle and amenities that made Willowbrook Estates the premier luxury community in the region. I spent the weeks leading up to the festival documenting everything. Photographs of the lake at normal levels, video recordings of the pristine water quality, detailed logs of my pump operations and water flow measurements. If anyone questioned my actions, I had comprehensive evidence that I was operating within my legal rights as a water rights holder. The night before the festival, I made final preparations. All 30 pumps were tested and ready. The electrical systems were checked and double-checked. The monitoring equipment was calibrated and recording. I set my alarm for dawn and tried to sleep, but I was too excited. After months of harassment, legal battles, and the destruction of my family's legacy, I was finally going to fight back. Tomorrow, Corinne Whitmore and her wealthy neighbors were going to learn what happened when you picked a fight with someone who controlled the water. I woke up before my alarm, my heart racing with anticipation. The sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern ridge as I walked down to the main pump station. The morning air was crisp and still, perfect weather for the Willowbrook Estates summer festival that would begin in just a few hours. I stood at the control panel and took a deep breath. Months of planning, weeks of installation, and countless hours of legal research had led to this moment. I was about to turn off the tap that had sustained Corinne Whitmore's luxury development for the past decade. I activated the first pump. The motor hummed to life, and I watched the flow meter register as hundreds of gallons per minute began flowing toward my north pasture instead of toward the lake. Then the second pump. Then the third. One by one, I brought all 30 pumps online until the entire spring output was being diverted away from its natural course. The sound was incredible. 30 industrial pumps running at full capacity created a symphony of mechanical power that could be heard across the entire ranch. The water flowed through the underground pipes like a river, emerging at distribution points throughout my property in powerful streams that quickly soaked into the thirsty soil. I climbed to the ridge that overlooked the lake and settled in with binoculars and a thermos of coffee to watch the show. From this vantage point, I could see the entire Willowbrook Estates development spread out below me. The lake was the centerpiece, surrounded by million-dollar homes and manicured lawns. The community center where festival preparations were underway was visible on the far shore. The lake level began to drop almost immediately. At first, it was subtle. The water line receded from the carefully maintained beaches by a few inches. The floating docks that had been perfectly positioned at water level began to sit slightly higher. The change was gradual but constant. By mid-morning, the effect became more noticeable. The lake level had dropped by nearly 2 feet, exposing muddy banks and the concrete foundations of the shoreline improvements. The water that remained was no longer crystal clear. Without the constant flow of fresh spring water, algae began to bloom in the stagnant pool, turning the surface green and creating an unpleasant smell. I watched through binoculars as the first festival guests arrived. Cars were pulling into the community center parking lot, and people were walking toward the lake carrying chairs and coolers. The morning swimming group that normally gathered at the beach stood at the water's edge, pointing and talking among themselves. My phone began ringing around 10 o'clock. Corinne Whitmore's name appeared on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. The voicemails were increasingly frantic. "Jake, this is Corinne. There is something wrong with the lake. The water level is dropping rapidly. If you know anything about this, you need to call me immediately. Jake, this is an emergency. The lake is nearly dry. We have 500 guests arriving today. You need to call me back right now. Jake, I know you are behind this. This is going to cost us millions of dollars. You are going to regret this. Call me back." By noon, the lake had become a shallow, stagnant pond. The boat ramp was high and dry. The swimming areas were muddy flats that stank of algae and dead fish. The fountains that normally created decorative water displays had run dry and sat silent. Festival guests were arriving to find their lakeside paradise transformed into an environmental disaster. The smell alone was enough to drive people away. Children who had been looking forward to swimming were crying. Adults who had paid for lakeside dining were demanding refunds. I could see Karen in her white festival dress standing at the edge of what had been the lake, gesturing frantically as she talked on her phone. She was surrounded by other HOA board members, festival organizers, and increasingly angry residents. The local news crew that had been invited to cover the event was filming the disaster instead of the celebration. The water that had been diverted to my pastures was creating its own spectacle. Areas of my ranch that had been brown and dormant were turning green before my eyes. The cattle were gathering around the new water sources, drinking deeply and grazing on grass that was suddenly abundant and lush. The contrast was perfect. Karen's luxury development was dying of thirst while my ranch was flourishing with life. The natural order was being restored. The water was flowing where it belonged, nourishing the land that had been its home for generations. By mid-afternoon, the festival had been canceled. Guests were leaving in droves, taking pictures of the environmental disaster and posting them on social media. The news crew was interviewing angry residents about property values and environmental concerns. The county health department had been called to investigate potential public health hazards from the stagnant water. Karen's phone calls became increasingly desperate and threatening. She was promising legal action, criminal charges, and personal vengeance. But she could not prove I was doing anything illegal. I was simply exercising my legal right to use water that originated on my property. The local sheriff arrived at my ranch around 4 o'clock. Deputy Martinez was someone I had known for years. He had grown up on a ranch himself and understood the importance of water rights. "Jake," he said, "I have to ask, are you responsible for what is happening to the lake?" "I am using my water rights to improve irrigation on my ranch," I said. "Everything I am doing is legal and properly documented." He nodded and looked out over my suddenly green pastures. "That is what I figured. Karen Whitmore is screaming about criminal charges, but my understanding is that you have senior water rights that predate their development." "That is correct," I said. "My great-grandfather established these rights in 1924. "Well then," he said with a slight smile, "I guess she should have thought about that before she tore down your barn." That evening, I stood on my ridge and watched the sunset reflect off the muddy remains of Karen Whitmore's lake. The 30 pumps continued their steady work, nourishing my land and restoring the natural balance that had been disrupted by greed and arrogance. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. Justice had been served, and it tasted like spring water. The legal battle that followed was swift and decisive. Karen Whitmore and the HOA filed emergency motions seeking to force me to restore water flow to the lake. They claimed I was engaging in malicious interference with their property rights and causing millions of dollars in damages. The hearing was held 3 days after the festival disaster. The courtroom was packed with HOA residents, media representatives, and curious observers who had followed the story. Karen arrived with a team of expensive lawyers and a folder full of property damage assessments. I arrived with Sam Rodriguez, my water rights documentation, and Dr. Mitchell's irrigation system plans. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully. My great-grandfather's homestead patent, 3 generations of continuously maintained water rights, state law regarding surface water capture and use, the HOA's development permits and water access agreements. Mr. Morrison, the judge said, you have absolute legal authority to use water that originates on your property. The defendant's development was built with full knowledge that they were dependent on water controlled by upstream property owners. The court finds no legal basis to restrict your exercise of established water rights. Karen's face turned red as the judge continued. Furthermore, the court notes that the emergency demolition of Mr. Morrison's barn appears to have been conducted without proper notice or due process. The court recommends that all parties consider mediation to resolve remaining disputes. The HOA's legal defeat was complete and public. Karen was forced to resign as president within a week as angry residents demanded accountability for the financial disaster she had created. Property values plummeted as the environmental damage to the lake became clear. The development company that had been planning Phase 3 expansion abandoned the project entirely. I agreed to mediation, but this time I was negotiating from a position of strength. The new HOA leadership was composed of reasonable people who understood that cooperation was better than confrontation. We reached an agreement that gave me permanent legal protections against future harassment in exchange for restoring partial water flow to the lake. The irrigation system that I had built to exact my revenge became the foundation for the most productive ranch operation in the county. My cattle herd expanded from 50 head to over 200. My pastures became a showcase of sustainable agriculture that attracted visitors from across the state. Most importantly, I used part of my restored water flow to create a memorial garden on the site where my barn had stood. I planted native wildflowers and installed a stone marker honoring my great-grandfather and the generations of my family who had worked this land. The spring water flows through the garden in a series of natural pools that reflect the sky and nourish the earth. Every morning, I walk through the garden and down to the spring that started it all. The water still bubbles up from the limestone aquifer, crystal clear and cold. The sound is the same as it was when my great-grandfather first heard it nearly a century ago. I have learned that standing up to bullies requires more than good intentions. It requires knowledge, preparation, and the willingness to fight back when peaceful solutions fail. Most importantly, it requires understanding your own power and using it wisely. The lake has recovered somewhat, though it will never be the pristine showcase it once was. The HOA has learned to respect the rights of their neighbors, and I have learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting natural justice take its course. My ranch is thriving. My family's legacy is secure. And every time I hear those 30 pumps humming in the distance, I remember the day I turned off Corinne Whitmore's tap and restored the natural order of things.